Pleasure to be here and have a chance to talk to all of you, and appreciate the very nice things that Representative Coleman and others have said here. You know, I don't always get such nice introductions. Now, that's not because people want to be mean to me or anything, but because I'm a demographer, and a lot of people don't really know what a demographer is. I remember well, I was in a small town in East Texas, and a gentleman had been given the job of introducing me and got ill at the very last moment. And so another gentleman had to introduce me, and he got, you know, I could tell he was having trouble with this word demographer, because it's not one that everybody uses. And so he got up and he said, well, you know, Dr. Murdock's done a lot of things. He's done a lot of rural things, and he's done a lot of well, I guess he's best just seen as a rural demagoguer. Well, I'm going to try not to be a demagoguer today. I want to talk about population change in Texas and some of the implications of that. And I'm going to go through a lot of slides fast, but I'm going to ask you to look at only one aspect of it. So if you get a slide in about the third one, you say, my God, how do I know what's going on in that one? I'll tell you what I really want you to look at. Well, this is through the very last decennial census. Texas has had phenomenal growth. We're leading the pack in all the different ways that you can see it here. This shows Texas and the U.S., and you can see that I like to say in every period of time since Texas first allowed the U.S. to join it, we have grown more rapidly than the country as a whole. One of the things I like to get out of the way right away is this issue of undocumented immigrants. And the reason I want to bring it up at all is because not only is there a lot of discussion about it, but because there's a lot of misunderstanding about it. The person who does the best job of estimating undocumented immigrants, by the way, is a guy who got his degree at the University of Texas. He's a demographer. And Jeff Bissell, his name is. And I said, you know, Jeff, how do you know that, you know, I hear 20 million, 25 million, 15 million. How do you know that there are only 11 or 12 million if you look at the United States? And if you look at Texas, about 1.6, 1.7 million people. I said, how do you know after all they're undocumented? He says, you know, there is one thing you cannot hide, and that is dying. And if there are actually this, you know, much, much larger number, he said, well, then they are the healthiest group of people that ever walked the face of the earth, because they die at a level of about 11 or 12 million in the U.S. and about 1.6 or 7 million in Texas. Let's talk about the growth, though, because this is what's one of the important things to point out. And I know there's lots of numbers on here, and I'll point out to them. But this is the most recent period of time for which we have data, which is through 2015. And if you look at the last two columns, for example, you can see that we have dominated the growth. We dominated the growth in the 2000-2010. We dominated the growth in 2010 to 15. And phenomenal growth, really, in terms of our overall population. This is the 10 states with the largest percentage increase. And I got to tell you something. You're looking at this slide for one reason and one reason only. I am a native of the great state of North Dakota, and I never thought I'd live long enough to see North Dakota at the top of any population chart. Now, some people are going to say, well, but it was only 84,000. I say, you know, a number is a number. I mean, it's at the top in percentages. But you can see that Texas, again, is at the top of that growth chart. Well, this is the 20 counties in Texas with the fastest growth, largest growth. You can see that it pretty much follows what you would guess. Large urban counties, for example, Harris County, Dallas County, Bexar County, Tarrant County, Travis County, Collin County, etc. All of those are been fast-growing counties. And this is the largest in terms of the United States. And here I want you to note, you know, take that 2015 column and look down there. There's New York at 20 million. There's LA at 13 million. And we're talking about Houston at 6.7 million, and Dallas-Fort Worth, these are MSA, 7.1 million. So, but look at the growth. With half the number of people, in most cases, or in some cases almost a third, our growth is greater than that which is occurring in much larger states. So we're just having substantial population growth. Now I want to just go through, and these that are outlined in yellow are the counties in Texas, of course. This is all counties in the United States, and natural increase is the excess of births over deaths. And you can see here, in fact, population grow by one of two mechanisms. That is natural increase, excess of births over deaths, and through migration, okay? And you can see here that our major counties are key ones in terms of natural increase. Our birth rates are fairly high still. And then this is international migration. We don't really rank as high, except for Harris County in immigration, as we might think we do. And this then is the 20 counties in the United States ranked by domestic migration. Notice those key suburban counties, in addition to Harris County, for example, and Bexar County, which of course is Houston and San Antonio. We're talking about some very strong growth in some key suburban counties. So we have growth in really all parts of our state and all parts of things. Now, I want to do something very simple here, and I'll go through it very quickly. Populations grow by one of two basic mechanisms: natural increase, which is the excess of births over deaths, and through migration. And migration can be international migration, or immigration as we sometimes call it, and domestic migration. And the reason I want to show these charts is that when we talk about growth, everybody seems to forget about the big one. Natural increase is in almost all parts of Texas the fastest, the largest contributor to population growth. And so, this is Texas as a whole. You can see half of that growth is due to natural increase, 20% to international migration, 32% due to domestic migration. But now I want to just quickly go through a whole set of these. This is Bexar County, 42%, 41%, 17%. This is Dallas County. Now, that small sliver is domestic migration. And when you look at that, one of the things to understand about Dallas County is that if you compare it, for example, to Harris County, it is substantially, just physically smaller. And so you're going to see patterns of change that are quite different and it is totally landlocked, so to speak, by very, very rapidly growing suburban counties. Well, this is Harris County. This is Tarrant County, of course, Fort Worth. This is Travis County. Travis County has one of the largest domestic migration flows in the state. And now I want to look at something else. I want you to look at the percent of total change column, that one that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 over. And that's the percent of growth during the last census decade that came about from each of the different racial and ethnic groups: non-Hispanic whites, Hispanics, non-Hispanic black, non-Hispanic Asian, non-Hispanic other. I want you to notice, for example, that this is Texas. 65% of the growth in Texas is due to the Hispanic population. That's the last decade, and there's no indication that it's not continuing to be that way. Non-Hispanic white, 11%, African Americans, about 12%, and then another 12%, which is Asian and other. But let's look a little bit more at this. This is the under 18. This is the children. What do you see? A negative value for non-Hispanic whites. And I'm going to show you a set of slides. You're going to get used to seeing that a negative number, okay? Because that is what we've had in terms of population patterns. Now let's look at a little bit about where this growth is. Blue is growth, red is decline. This is the non-Hispanic white population of Texas. Look at all the red, and look at where the blue is. Basically concentrated in what we call the triangle of Texas in terms of overall growth. Those pink ones, by the way, are counties that there's too small a number to really talk about growth. But you can see red is, as I said, blue is growth, red is decline. This is not a Hispanic white population. This is the Hispanic population. So clearly, that's a very rapidly growing population group. This is the African American population. One of the most interesting things about this is if you take the Old South part of Texas, which is really East Texas, where you see all that red is where we really had our largest African American populations in our history. Those populations are declining. They're concentrating in the same 3 urban centers as the rest of our population. This is the Asian population. Lots of pink there, meaning lots of counties that have too small a number to count. Very clear concentration in terms of the triangle. This is the United States. Again, let's go over to that percent of total change. In the United States, 56% of the growth is due to the Hispanic population. That's in the U.S. as a whole. Another 8% is due to the non-Hispanic white, 14% to African Americans, 16% to Asians, etc. If you look down that percent of total change column. This is the United States for under 18. And I want you to look at this case at the third column of numbers that starts with that minus 4,310,000 people. What that's saying is that in terms of our under 18 population, it is actually decreasing, and substantially, for non-Hispanic whites. What is offsetting it is the increase in our number of Hispanic population. In other words, whether you look at the country or whether you look at Texas, you're going to see the same kinds of patterns. And basically that pattern is that if we don't, if we didn't have growth in minority populations, we would be declining. If you take the country as a whole, basically our population has been in natural decrease for about 30 years in Texas, the non-Hispanic white population. This is just looking at the same thing we talked about before. We'll go through. This is just blue is growth, red is decline. This is the non-Hispanic white population. This is the Hispanic population. Blue is growth. This is the African American population, okay? And look at a lot of decline in the Old South, okay? Growth especially in the two coasts. And this is the Asian population. Of course, there's a much smaller base, but is still growing substantially. Well, let's talk for a few minutes about the regions. These are the 4 major regions of the country according to the Census Bureau. A little bit biased from about 50 years ago when they set these up in terms of population size. But I just wanted you to see these because I want to talk a little bit about those. Very same thing. This is the Northeast region. And what I'm trying to get through here is to see that these are not just a few areas. These are very pervasive. So if you look at that numerical column, what do we see? We see that the non-Hispanic white population decreased by 1.3 million. The Hispanic population increased by 1.7 million. African American about 265,000. Asian 930,000. All others 109,000. This is a less than 18. Northeast, a decline rather, of 1.2 million non-Hispanic whites. Again, offset in part by about 430,000 Hispanics and about 165,000 Asians. This is the Midwest. Again, absolute decline number of non-Hispanic white populations. Look at that numeric column, that third column, offset by a very large increase in the Hispanic population. This is the Midwest region under 18, loss of 1.3 million. Let's go through them very quickly. This is the South region. The South has been the banner of growth in the U.S. for some time now. But you can see that non-Hispanic white, about 2.8 million increase, Hispanic about 6.7. African American population has has increased more rapidly than the non-Hispanic white population in the South. And if you look at the less than 18, same pattern. That is a decline in the number of non-Hispanic white, an increase in the Hispanic population. This is the West, last one of our regions. Growth in all areas. And then when you get to the under 18, the child population, you see the same kind of patterns, decline in non-Hispanic white children, increase in the number of Hispanics and other population groups. Well, what about different regions, different types of areas? Very quickly, we're going to talk about central cities, okay? And again, I want you to look at that. Central cities in the United States, increase of 263,000 in terms of non-Hispanic whites, an increase of 13 million Hispanics in that same period of time. This is the Central City population. Central City, absolute decline in number of non-Hispanic whites, increase of 4 million in the number of Hispanics. That's that same third column. This is the suburban population, 1.5 million increase in non-Hispanic whites. This is the only population where non-Hispanic white the only resident area where we actually have larger increase in non-Hispanic whites than we do in other populations. And this is the under 18, again, negative for non-Hispanic whites in that third column, increase for Hispanics. This is non-metropolitan areas, again, same kind of largest increase for non-Hispanic whites, a good size increase for for Hispanics, good increase there, less increase, but still an increase for non-Hispanic whites. And the non-metropolitan counties, those of you that are in rural counties, you can note this pattern, non-Hispanic whites decreasing, and Hispanic populations, again, increasing. So you see the same kind of patterns that we're seeing. In other words, the patterns that we're seeing, my point is the patterns we're seeing aren't just a few places. They aren't just in Texas, they aren't just in the South, they aren't just in the West. They're pervasive patterns across the United States and have been now for a number of decades. Well, let's look at another factor here. Let's change and begin to look at the socioeconomics. And we'll take that 2009 population, and what I want you to look at is the median household income. And I want you to note non-Hispanic whites, about 55,000, Hispanics about 40,000, African Americans about 33,000, Asians about 69,000, overall about 50,000, but we'll be looking at that again. So let's go to the Northeast. Same kind of patterns. Lowest income for non-Hispanic whites, lowest income for Hispanics and for non-Hispanic African Americans. If we look at the Midwest, same kind of patterns. We look at the South, the same kind of patterns as well. In other words, our fastest growing populations are also those that have the fewest socioeconomic resources. The populations that have and by the way, when we talk about slow growth in the non-Hispanic white population, keep in mind that non-Hispanic whites, as I said before, have had below replacement fertility now for 25 years. And so as a person in the audience recently told me, he said, "You're saying we're not coming back." And I said, well, I don't know if I want to say it quite that way, but in a sense, it's pretty hard. We're getting to the point where it'll be pretty hard for us to come back and be, the fastest growing population base given the age structure. Same thing when it comes to regions here. This is the 4 regions. Again, look at that right-handmost column. You see the very clear patterns of socioeconomic differences. And now let's look a little bit at our own areas. This is the Austin Round Rock MSA. I'm just going to talk about the 4 MSAs because of time. 65,000 income for non-Hispanic whites, 40,000 basically for Hispanics, 38 to 39 for African Americans, 67 for Asians, 55 overall. But notice that you'll see that pattern again, and when we go to Dallas-Fort Worth, same kind of patterns. About incomes for African Americans and for Hispanics being about 60 to 75% of what they are for other groups. This is Houston, same kind of pattern if you look at that right-handmost column. And San Antonio, a very, again, similar kind of pattern. When you look at the educational attainment, because income is one of the things we look at when we look at that issue. The other is educational attainment. And again, let's just take one here. I want to take the less than high school column. This is the United States. And I want you to compare and contrast the first 2. That is the 9.3% with less than high school for non-Hispanic whites, the 37.8% for Hispanics, okay? And you can see then the percentages for other groups as well, but I want to concentrate on that for just a few minutes. This is the Northeast region, and again, we're going to see that less than high school for Hispanics, 33%. If we take the Midwest region, same Hispanics 38%, non-Hispanic whites 9% with less than high school. If you take the Southern region, 37% for Hispanics and 11% for non-Hispanic whites. In the Western region, 40% and 6.5%. And then finally, let's look a little bit more at this issue of the population in terms of education. This is Texas now. Notice that Austin, Hispanics less than high school, 39%. Dallas, 56%. Houston, 51%. And then San Antonio. San Antonio is about 28%. It's the lowest. It's got, in a sense, the highest rate of Hispanics that have higher levels of education. Now, why might that be the case? Well, because Hispanics have been an important group there for lots and lots and lots of years. And you know, one of the things that's very interesting to me is I was giving a presentation to the Hispanic Chamber in San Antonio, Texas. Okay? And as it is often done, I was the speaker, and they say, you go sit over there and, you know, don't get lost because we need you later. So just sit down at the table. And pretty soon I had 4 young Hispanic women sitting down at my table talking. And I heard one say to the other, yeah, you know, my grandmother jabbers at me and I don't understand a word she says. And her friend says, yeah, I know what you mean. So when we got all done, I said to him, I said, how many of you, they were all Hispanic, so how many of you do not speak Spanish? There's 10 of them. 7 of them did not speak Spanish. Now, is that unusual? Well, my name is Murdock. I don't speak much Gaelic. Some of you are German. You don't speak much German, okay? But what you're seeing in a city like San Antonio is that kind of assimilation, kind of acclimation that we have seen for groups time and time and time again. Now, that's neither good nor bad. It simply indicates that we're seeing in some of the areas that have had heavy concentrations, we're seeing that assimilation pattern. You know, they're multi-generational people. Well, let's talk about the future. This is the U.S., and these are in millions. So if we look at that total column there, you're expecting about 420 million Americans by 2060. We're expecting that white alone, that's non-Hispanic whites, or what we sometimes call Anglos, 179 million by 2060, and Hispanics about second with about 128 million. Now, this is U.S. in 2010. In terms of total numbers, I'll just go on behind this to make up some time here. But we're seeing the same kind of patterns over time. This is numerical change in U.S. population by race projected by the Census Bureau from 2010 to 2060. Go over the left-hand side. What do you see? They expect a net decline. This is numerical change, so this is millions. They're expecting a net decline in terms of the change. Now, this is just the change part. Decline of basically 18 million non-Hispanic whites. Offset by about 18 million non-African Americans, about 19 million Asians, about 15 million of all other groups, and then 78 million Hispanics. Now, and this tells us in terms of, if we look at it by just the categories of change that we're projected to have, 61% of the growth is expected to be due to the Hispanic population. Virtually none. Why? Because this is growth, and we're not going to grow non-Hispanic whites. And you can see the other population groups as well. This is the population patterns in terms of growth. There's another thing here that's very important. And it's very, very, very useful to me, because as I've gotten older, it's been nice to be, I was part of the baby boom generation. We're the largest generation ever in the history of the United States in terms of population growth. And we just keep getting to be important in our age group, right? So that in this 65 and over, you know, we're 13% in 2010, but by 2060, we're going to be 22% of the total population. And notice that both of the first two, that is everybody under 19, is going to decrease in terms of the proportion that is due to, this is going to decrease over time. Well, let's talk about Texas. These are projections that we've done for Texas. Very rapid growth under the one that we're going closest to now is this net migration. And you see we're having rapid population growth, but notice again, non-Hispanic white, yes, we're different than the country. We're going to go from 11.4 million to 12 million. For Hispanics, we're going to go from 9 to 30 million. African Americans, 2.9 to about 5.2. Asians, about 1.4 to 7.3. This means we're going to have this kind of proportional change by 2050 under any of the scenarios. Over 50% of our population will be Hispanic. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about education. Why? Because the factor that has been the most important factor in terms of success of different racial and ethnic groups and different immigration groups and everything else has been education. Education has been in the United States the great equalizer, that which brought us into competitiveness as different groups of people. Let's talk about education for a few minutes. And let's take the 2010 numbers there. This is the proportion of the population that is school and college graduates. You can see non-Hispanic whites, 34%, for example, college graduates and higher. Asians, 46%. Hispanics, 12%. African Americans, about 20%. Those differences translate into differences when it comes to earnings. This is educational levels, okay? This is median weekly earnings and unemployment rate, and notice how that goes in terms of education. Education does pay. It pays for every single racial and ethnic group, but it doesn't pay as much for some groups as others. But look at what we're talking about in terms of the patterns of change that we expect over time. This is another very important category, because this is all four racial and ethnic groups, all different set of four different occupations, categories. And what I want you to note is that for every group of people at all different types of occupations, as you go from left to right along those rows, what you find out is that, yes, education pays for everybody. It pays for everybody, not just for some groups. Now, does it pay the same? No. In fact, for non-Hispanic whites being in that manager and professional job category, $150,000. Now, interesting, when you get to Asian and others, it's $131,000. Hispanics, $116,000. And then for African Americans, about $99,000. But as you go from left to right from all of those, education pays, and the data shows consistently that that has been true now for at least 30 years. Okay? Now, finally, well, let's not take a look at that right now. Would you like to take a look at this one? The one that gets most attention when I show this one in across the state is that right-hand column there, the right-hand bottom figure. Okay, that's in terms of general revenues in terms of public colleges and universities. We'll come back to that. This is, again, simply looking at the enrollments that we expect over time and the change in the percentages. This is total public education, elementary and secondary education. Notice the 65%, basically. 2 of every 3 kids in our school system by 2050 we expect In the elementary and secondary, we expect to be Hispanic, about 15% non-Hispanic whites, about 9% African Americans, and about 12% Asian and others. And then let's talk just a little bit, I'm about done here. This is consumer expenditures, okay, projected for 2050 under alternative assumptions of socioeconomic closure. That is, if we had closure in education, which meant closure in income, what would happen? Well, right now, what you see is that 49,000 is mean consumer expenditures. If we assume that the race ethnicity specific rates continue, that is, we don't change by education and other things, the socioeconomics that go with our demographics, we have an absolute decline in real dollars. If we had average rates of closure, which we've had recently, that 49, this is in constant dollars, would become 63. And if we had full closure of educational levels for all racial and ethnic groups that are not non-Hispanic white, to those of non-Hispanic whites, we could have an income, an average income here of $89,000. And this is the percent of all persons in poverty. It's about 18% in Texas. If we do nothing, it's going to go up to about 21%. If we get average closure between groups, we'll get it down to about 20%. But if we got poverty rates for all racial and ethnic groups down to what they are for non-Hispanic whites, it would be a 12% rate of increase or poverty rate overall. And then this, one of the final slides, is that red or that blue line up there is what would happen if we just kept pace on a per capita kind of basis. What this says is that aggregate household income, if we do nothing to change the socioeconomics that go with the demographics, what we expect to see is a decline in aggregate household income, aggregate net worth, aggregate average household income, net worth per households. The only factor on that thing, which will increase if we don't change the socioeconomics that go with the demographics, is poverty. Poverty will increase faster than overall household change. And this is a U.S. pattern, by the way. The U.S. pattern is the same as, in a broad sense, as that for Texas. I could tell that many of you were deeply moved. Appreciate you not deeply moving to the exit yet. So what am I saying here? I've looked at this for, well, I hate to say how many years now. I've only been in Texas 40 years. And, you know, I used to say that I made a mistake one time after I'd been here about 20 years. I was in a crowd and I said, well, I'm not a native Texan, but I've been here 20 years, so I guess that makes me a Texan. And this guy's hand goes up in the back of the room. He says, I want to tell you, if you ain't born in Texas, you ain't never a Texan. Okay, so I don't ever claim that I'm a Texan. Now it's 40 years. But the point that I'm trying to make in all of this is the demographics that we have the fastest growing populations are those who have the lower levels of education, the lower levels of income. And if we want Texas to be greater, we have to raise the income and the education that goes with that for our minority populations. Now, this is not some wild-eyed liberal guy. I'm not very, you know, my wife says I'm the most conservative demographer she's ever met. Okay. I don't know how many demographers she's met, but anyway. But my point is simply that our future of Texas is tied to its minority populations. And how well they do is how well we all will do. Thank you. Okay. Questions?